Welcome to the Desire to Dream podcast. I'm your host, Lo Wilder. The vision of this podcast is to provide tools on how to become successful in your finances, business, leadership development, and much more. A little bit about me: I grew up in the hood, homeless at the age of 14. I made a choice not to become a product of my environment. And today, I am a successful businessman, community leader, and inspirational speaker. It is my desire to encourage and empower you to unlock your greatness. So tune in and enjoy the show. And welcome back to another episode of the Desire to Dream podcast. It's your host, Lo Wilder. Man, welcome back, all my dreamers and achievers. Today, we have a special guest, my sister, Miss Emely. She goes by M. And I'm just so excited to have you on the podcast. We're going to be talking about mental health, just clarity, therapeutic stuff that is going to help our listeners just free their minds so they can really attack their dreams and goals and what they want to achieve. So how you doing all the way up in NYC?
I'm doing all right. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to talk bibliotherapy with you today.
Oh man, listen, I was like doing some research on you, and I was at first wasn't aware of the type of therapy that you do. And when I saw it, I was like, wow, like you shared a story in the podcast that I was listening to about how your students were just afraid or really just, there's a stigma with mental health and they didn't want to go in the room. And I started thinking back in my elementary days and said, I
Mm.
remember getting pulled out of the class. Like that wasn't cool, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah. So I love how the type of therapy you're doing, and especially in the times that we're in, because we want to break the stigma, we want to break down the walls. And
Absolutely.
yeah, so before we get into what you do, really love for you to share with the audience, a little bit about your background, because as we just talked about, we do have some similarities and some things in common, and I love to hear more about it because it'll really help bridge that.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead,
I,
sis.
I didn't know how much we had in common, in fact.
Right.
Yeah, I was born and raised in Connecticut. Went to school at Smith. Well, I went to Mount Holyoke, which led me to Smith College School for Social Work, where I was placed in the Bronx as a social worker in training. But long before that, I sort of found my way. I'm not sure how far back you want me to go in terms.
We want to free people today, right?
Yes,
Like
we
if you're
do
listening to this
every day.
episode, we want to free you, right, to being very self-aware and where you are.
Yeah.
And in doing that, you sometimes have to go back. So yeah,
Yeah, well, let's do it. Let's take it further
let's
back then.
go.
Let's
Let's
take
go
it further
way back,
back.
back into time.
Yeah, let's go back. So honestly, I was raised by my grandmother.
Okay.
My parents were teen parents. My father's African American, my mother is Puerto Rican.
Mm-hmm.
And I was raised by my grandmother. And unfortunately, to try to provide for me, my father ended up going to the military, because when you're a 17-year-old Black man, right, what are your choices in
Right.
America?
Right.
Especially if you're having a baby and your education is cut short. So he went to the military, got addicted to cocaine while he was there, and came back. It was a crack epidemic. Unfortunately, became
Mm-hmm.
addicted to drugs.
Right.
And so I didn't grow up with my dad. I grew up knowing, of my African American family, and I had an aunt who would come visit me regularly and take me to family barbecues and things like that. But
Mm-hmm.
that part of my family was very much estranged.
Mm.
And so my grandmother, she did the best she could with me. I think she did pretty great, because she gave me enough of a foundation, that when she suddenly passed away, I was 14 years old. I had a lot of good stuff that I
Mm.
internalized. I had my faith in God. I had my love of literature. I had a pretty solid foundation, academically. I was always really good with school, but she always sort of encouraged that.
Mm.
Like with her, it wasn't no coming home with anything less than a B. She wasn't
Right.
so hard on me that a B wouldn't suffice. But my grandmother really, she just had high expectations of me, and she made it very clear to me, like, that the stakes were high. Like, look,
Mm-hmm.
you're a Black brown girl in America. You need to take school seriously. You need to understand, it's not a game out here, pretty much. So even though I fell into this pit of depression after she died, because we weren't expecting her to die. She had some
Mm.
health issues, but her death was very sudden. And then, when the matriarch of a family dies, the entire family system has to adjust. And
That's right. Right.
unfortunately, mine didn't adjust very well. And so I
Mm,
ended up getting into foster care. And I was in foster care. I lived with several different families. It started off with me living with friends, and then
mhm.
child welfare got
They
tip to
got
the
wind of
fact
it.
that, you know
Yeah.
what I'm saying? So I
Yeah.
was like, oh, we need a foster family. And I was so grateful my youth pastor and his wife took me in.
Oh wow,
Um,
beautiful.
and then as it got closer to applying to college, my guidance counselor was like, look, on paper, even though you're in foster care, it's kinship foster care, and your parents still have their rights. So you're not going to get much financial aid. You're going to have to legally divorce your parents in court. So I was like,
Mm,
what does that mean? She was like, you're going to have to get legally emancipated from your parents. They
wow.
haven't provided for you. You don't know where they are. Like, this is the best route for us to take. And that was a really hard um, decision for me to make because I didn't know what that would entail. And I was
Hmm.
also like, at this point, even though I had the support of my youth pastor, I was on my own. I was working two jobs. I was going to
Right.
high school, applying to colleges. Like, I did all of this literally on my own. So that was like a really terrifying prospect. But thankfully, my high school social worker, like, she helped me with everything.
Hmm.
And I did what I had to do to get legally emancipated and, get
Wow.
what I needed to get in order to be able to go to college and get the financial aid that I merited.
Hmm.
And the rest is history. I feel like there is no me today and the way that I do therapy without knowing my history, because it's
Right.
all a part of what's informed my practice. And of course,
Hmm.
like, just like anyone else, I went to school, I got the degrees, I got the licenses and all of that, but the way that I work is very much from a lens that's very pro black, that's very honoring of traditional ancestral ways of healing,
Hmm.
honoring of
Hmm.
indigenous and African, traditions of storytelling.
Yep. Yep.
And so when I started out working as a school social worker, it was very natural for me to like work with kids from the hood and
Hmm.
and to deal with all of the things that come with that, right? The
Right.
parents, which is not,
Right.
that's a
Nah,
difficult
that's a whole
terrain.
story in itself, right?
But yeah, it was like I kind of just like fell into it naturally because it's who
Yeah.
I was. And I remember being
Mm,
that girl who struggled to navigate all of the challenges that I needed to navigate in order to get to high school graduation. And if it
right.
hadn't been for my high school social worker, I probably wouldn't have been able to make it, quite honestly.
Wow, that's
Um,
powerful, man.
so
Hey,
because of her,
yeah.
I think I went along that same track.
Wow, man. Listen, I'm listening to your story and I'm like, yeah, we definitely have a lot in common. And her husband, shout out my brother Chad Rumble. We played, man,
So
5A football, youth football together and stay connected. He was on the podcast. Check that episode if you haven't already. Doing phenomenal things with young men. But I want to go back just a little bit because my mother's Puerto Rican and my father's black, African American,
same.
right? And so grandmother, the Spanish side, they like I was looked at. I was the first, by the way, African American and Hispanic in our family. So
Oh
yeah, so
wow.
my
You know
grandmother was
what?
like
Now that you're
old school.
saying that, yeah, I was too.
Yeah, so
Wow.
I was did your grandmother, did you have any? So my grandmother, I was like the outsider out of all my cousins because I was the one, the Moreno, right, the black
Yeah.
kid. And so did you have to deal with any of that? Because one of the things I when I was
Listen.
going through therapy, I thought about it like growing up, it was like I had the blacks that I was hanging with, and then the Puerto Ricans, and I was struggling with these two cultures because I'm both, and I was like trying to like be accepted and fit into both. I wasn't black enough, and in Spanish I wasn't Puerto Rican enough because I wasn't speaking the Spanish lingo like I should, as fluent as I wanted to. Did you struggle with
Yeah.
that?
I absolutely struggled with that. And when you think
Mm,
about racial identity development, it's all about the representations that you have, right,
yeah,
around you.
yeah.
And I didn't grow up. My mother, by the way, she's Puerto Rican, as was my grandmother, but racially white, fair skinned. So even like down to my hair, it was a big deal. Like, well,
Hmm.
what do we do with her hair? Right? Nobody knew how to do my hair. And for Black
Yeah.
women, our hair is our everything. So that
Hmm.
was really difficult. And just like not having representations, in books and shows. Um, Artwork around the house. Like, I just didn't see myself reflected as
Mm,
like a brown skinned girl.
right,
But
right.
then when I would spend time with my African American family, it was very much like, well, you think you're cute because you're light skinned, with good hair.
Yeah.
And it was
Yeah.
just like I could never quite find like my footing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
either way. And I knew my grandmother loved me, but I also knew that there was some, internalized racism,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
just based on some of the comments that I would hear. Or
Yeah.
I remember the first time that I had a really negative, experience, and I was called the N word. I must have been like 7 years old. And I remember
Mm.
coming home and talking to my grandmother about it. And she just like brushed it off, like, screw them. You're
Yeah.
not Black, you're
Yeah.
Puerto Rican. And I was like, that's not helpful because I
Right.
am Black and Puerto
Exactly.
Rican. And you're not.
Yeah.
And then my grandfather, who was very, very dark skinned, my
Mm.
grandmother's husband, he passed when I was 7. So the same year that this
Oh
happened,
wow. Yeah.
his response was like, um, yeah, the same thing. He said something along the lines of, people are gonna hate you because you have beautiful brown skin, but that has nothing to do with you. Like, just,
Mm.
and I was like, but you have darker skin than me.
Yeah.
So like, has anyone ever called you this word before? And what did you do? And he just like couldn't go there with me. And it showed me also like
Yeah.
the emotional capacity that we have
Yeah.
to have
Yes.
these difficult conversations with young children. And of course, like, our grandparents maybe didn't have the tools, right?
Right.
Or
Right.
the knowledge. In my grandmother's mind, it was kind of just like, well, you don't really spend time with your father or his family anyway. You're with me, and
Right.
this is how we do things. Somebody wants to call you the N word, like, you curse them out right back, or you
Yep.
walk away. And it's
Yep.
that simple. But when you're 7, you internalize that. You know that that's hateful. You know that that means something. And
Yes.
without a guide to kind of help you understand, like, why would somebody treat me with such hostility?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little girl and I'm
Yep.
just riding my bike, right? Spit on my bike.
Wow.
And I could cry just remembering that. Like, I was so traumatized.
Mm.
Um, and that's another reason why, like, telling our stories is so important, because if I had a book, let's say at 7 years old, that explained like that some people will treat me differently or treat me with hostility because of the color of my skin, and here's why, right? An age
Mm-hmm.
appropriate explanation, I
Right.
wouldn't have internalized that as something being wrong with me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wouldn't have internalized feeling like the black sheep because I was the first half black, half Puerto Rican member of my
In my
family, as
family.
being a
Yeah.
weird thing, right?
Right. Right.
Um,
Man, that's yeah, that's deep and powerful. And man, at a young age, like I've had similar incidents that were like that. Now, you talked about, your grandmother passing away. And this podcast is called Desire to Dream, right? The desire is like something that you really want, because you could, I want people to start thinking about what they want. And then the dream, like, what dream do you want to actually accomplish and achieve, and goals, right? So did you always know like you wanted to get into therapy? Like, what dreams did you have? Because here you are at 14, grandmother passed away, like your entire life shifted. I was homeless at 14 because my mother went to jail. My entire life shifted.
yep.
So I'm living in this house with 13 kids, right? And that's how I kind of went through it. Um and football was my escape route, my way of getting out of my situation so I can go to school. What was it for you? I know you said you had literature. So was it the books? Was it was it your youth pastor? Like, who was it that said, you know, this is what you should consider and think about, or is it something you came up on your own?
No, I was fortunate enough, again, because of my high school social worker and my high school guidance counselor, to get into a limited program. So I went to a public high school, but there was a beautiful Academy of the Arts that still exists, actually, the Greater Hartford Academy of the Arts.
Mm.
And so
Nice.
they offer scholarships to like a couple students in each major public school in Connecticut. And I applied and I got in. And when I got in, I was a part of the creative writing department. But within this school, you have dance, you have visual art. There's different majors that you could have, but
Mm,
as a student there, you're required to take courses in each of the creative arts disciplines. And being a part of that school, I was probably one of like 10 black brown kids in the
mm-hmm,
entire
mm-hmm.
school. But to be around kids who um just like a varying levels of privilege, different cultures, who spoke different languages, like, it just really enriched my life, and not just
Mm,
my life as a student, but like my inner life.
right,
Because I
right.
knew that I had always been drawn to the arts, but to actually like train and to learn the techniques of um dancing and drawing and bibliotherapy, it hit different, and it helped me understand the value in how the arts help us heal, how the
Hmm.
arts help give us the language, give us the tools to express ourselves, even when language is hard to find, right? Because language is also a very sophisticated thing. And when we're traumatized or we're deeply suffering, it can be hard to find the language.
Hmm.
So by going to this creative arts school, and it was, the bus would come pick us up at like 12:30 after lunch, and we'd be there until about 4 o'clock. But just for those few hours every day, like I had an outlet. I had an
Mm,
outlet. It was accessible. It was for me. I didn't have to worry about anything financial. um, it freed me of a burden of like
hmm.
being staying stuck in that small world.
Right.
My daughter, I'm so
Oh,
sorry.
it's all good. She's featured in the pod for all those. She sponsored this podcast episode. Everybody, nah, it's all good. It's
She's
all
playing
good.
right here at
Yeah.
my feet, tickling my
Oh
toes,
man, it's a
she's
beautiful
like
thing.
building a house with blocks around my feet.
Awesome. You're like, how am I going to break out of this after this episode? Right?
I
Like,
probably won't, but we'll figure it out.
it's
But I think
beautiful.
that's really what it was
Hmm.
and it's not just the academics that I learned there. It was also the adults. So like
Hmm.
I'll never forget Pamela Nomura. She was the director of the creative arts program there. She taught me so much. And it
Mm,
wasn't just creative writing. She
right.
would sit with me, pray for me. She's a Hawaiian woman. She would
Wow.
teach me so much about the indigenous roots of storytelling. I cried with her. She would literally like I get emotional just thinking about her. She would
Mm,
like hold me and rock me while I cried,
wow. That's
you know?
beautiful, man.
And I
Wow.
think to be treated with such empathy and love and compassion from someone when you didn't get mothering in that way was like
Yeah.
really, really healing. And then
Wow.
she gave me the
Wow.
tools. Like I'll never forget. I wrote a piece that everybody loves, and she was like, "We need to submit your piece to this writing contest at UConn." And
Wow.
I was like, "I'm never gonna win that." But because of her, I submitted and I won. And
Yeah.
I'll never forget they
Beautiful.
wanted me to appear like at the awards ceremony, and I felt so self-conscious low because I was like, I'm gonna be the only one there without parents.
Mm,
And when I tell you, it didn't matter that I didn't have parents because my school social worker showed up, my high school guidance counselor showed up.
right.
Like so many people showed up for me. And
Yeah.
and I didn't
Yeah.
know they were gonna show up. So I get up there to perform my poem and I look out into the audience and like I have my
You got the
head down.
support. Yeah. You got the support team there.
Listen,
Like, oh man.
when I tell you, when I lifted up my head, I was like, look at God, you
Wow.
know? So just like also that reminder of like you're never alone. If you
Hmm.
can like you may feel like you're reaching out your hands for someone
Hmm.
that's not there, but there's always gonna be someone who's reaching back
Yeah.
their hands
Yeah.
out to you. You just have to be open and willing to receive it.
Yes.
Um
That's the key.
and of course my faith taught me that too, like
Hmm.
God isn't everything, God isn't everyone, and if you can be open to what spirit is doing and who he's
Hmm.
bringing in your life, and the seasons of life and why certain
Right.
people come in during certain chapters of your life, then you'll be
Hmm.
surprised to find that even your suffering can be beautiful,
Yes.
because
Yes.
spirit always turns that into our
Your
gifts.
let your pain become your purpose, right? Your traumatic, whatever it was, because again, we both could have easily been like, man, I'm not gonna do anything with my life. No one cares. No one's here like to support. But like you said, there are people there that support. God will put individuals in your life.
Yes.
And so if you're listening to this podcast, always know that if you have to be willing and be open to receive those things in order for you to really feel the love. And it may not come from those who you want, right? I mean,
Right.
like you said, like your grandmother's gone. I'm sure she wanted to see you graduate from high school, graduate from college. She wanted to see her great grandchildren, right? But life be life and things happen,
I
and we
know
just
that's
have
right.
to just pivot and transform. Let's pivot into the bibliotherapy. Kind of explain to the listeners what what that entails, like, because it's new to me, but the technique, or the technique's not new, but the term is. And so kind of explain a little bit of what you do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So bibliotherapy was like we all do it. We just don't call it that. So I love what you said, which is like, I know what it is,
Right.
but tell us about like the actual incorporation of it in clinical practice. So bibliotherapy is under the umbrella of the creative arts therapies. So dance therapy, art therapy, etc. And bibliotherapy was really the term bibliotherapy wasn't coined by the American Library Association until 1966. But before then, the Library War Service really was sending books abroad to where
Hmm.
soldiers were deployed and creating libraries on bases so that
Hmm.
soldiers could have a tie back to home.
Right.
And so this started sort of incorporating like the use of reading texts, of reading literature, not just to, you know, sort of connect soldiers back to home, but to deal with some of the symptoms that they were experiencing: anxiety, depression, PTSD. And so, as you go into the 70s and deinstitutionalization happens in mental health care, this is where we start like shutting down um, the psychiatric wards and
Right.
things. We start moving towards a more community based way of treating mental health. So now you have more programs opening up. You have more psychologists and psychiatrists and mental health clinicians overall thinking about creative ways to
Right.
serve clients in the community.
Hmm.
And so people started to incorporate bibliotherapy into their therapy practices. And so there's a lot of books on the use of early like bibliotherapy, but they're mostly out of print. I
Hmm.
think this is where you start to see um, in the UK, especially folks like Ella Berthoud, Susan Elderkin. These are women who are bibliotherapists who actually created like a nonprofit
Hmm.
to bring more attention to these techniques that were used like back in the day and that we still use because people are always reading to
Hmm.
heal, to understand, to find information. But like you mentioned, we just weren't calling it bibliotherapy. So I think
Right.
with like the publication of books like The Novel Cure, The Story Cure, um, bibliotherapy sort of got back on the map. And now people are excited about it again and wanting to really talk about what it is and how it's used. And so I think one of the main, distinctions to make is that bibliotherapy is for everyone. So some
Hmm.
people will say that they're bibliotherapists and they may not necessarily be mental health
Mm.
therapists. Some bibliotherapists are librarians. So there's teachers
Okay.
who also train as bibliotherapists. The nonprofit organization, it's the only credentialing organization in our country.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It might be the only credentialing organization in the world, but I'm not sure on that. So don't quote me on
Yeah.
that. But
Yeah. I
definitely in the
got you.
United States is
Hmm.
the International Federation
Gotcha.
of Bibliopoetry Therapy.
Gotcha. So is it certain books? Is it only novels? Like, what type of books?
We read
Any book?
everything. Yeah,
Anything.
we read, and it really
Okay.
just depends on the expertise and the comfort level of the therapist. Like for me, because I do have my bachelor's is in
Hmm.
literature.
Hmm.
Um, my expertise is in Black and Caribbean literature.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
I use all genres of literature, and I have intake that I give to clients where I really assess who you are as a reader. So your
Hmm.
reading preferences, your genre preferences, also your reading style. Um, and that sort of helps me pair you with the books that I think would be most therapeutic for you.
Right. Right.
And so because I'm a mental health therapist, I'm looking at exactly what are you struggling with, what are your symptoms, who are you as a reader, and then I'll use that information to prescribe books that I
Mm.
think will aid you on your healing journey in this
Hmm.
particular season of life. So I have people who I've worked with, like maybe I worked with you when you were in seventh grade and we were reading some Jason Reynolds, and you come back to me at 18, now you're a young man about to go off to college and you
Hmm.
need some support with life transitions. Maybe that's more of like a nonfiction book recommendation. So it really just depends on like where my
Yeah. Where
where my
where the
client is in
clients
their
are.
life. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. As you can see, I got the library in the back.
Yes.
And I'm gonna tell like the audience, those who are listening, I was not a reader. Like, I was a football player. I was, I was, hey, how
I
did,
love it.
I started reading honestly, when I was starting out in my career in sales, and I was like really struggling with sales. Like, I was in retail, worked at the pharmacy, all through high school and in college, but I was struggling. Like like I didn't go to school to be a salesperson. So I
Mhm.
started off like trying to read that. Then it became like financial, like, so I'm reading Tony Robbins, I'm reading about Dave Ramsey. And so I just it was therapeutic in a way, to read and gain this knowledge that I was able now to apply, and then it brought success. So yeah, I'm a big reader now. And if I'm not reading an actual book, because I'm old school, I love the books. I
Yes.
can't do the Kindles, and I can do Audible. I can do Audible because I'm commuting a lot. But yeah, reading is definitely therapeutic. And the thing that a statistic that always it always shocked me, right? The
I
average American
know.
reads one book a year. And the problem that I see a lot of times is when we graduate from school, some people don't read at all. Um, what would be the issue that you would see in individuals who are not reading,
So
especially?
I love that question because I think so. The first thing I want to say is that like literacy in and of itself is a privilege, right? Like our ancestors were not able to learn how to read. If they did have access to learning how to read, it had to be kept a secret.
Mm-hmm.
And we have real developmental, structural issues as a community around access to quality education for our children,
Mm-hmm.
around early identification of learning disability for Black and Brown children. So there's like a lot of barriers, I
Mm-hmm.
think, to literacy in our
Mm-hmm.
communities in particular. And I do think that that poses an issue, right? Because if we can't read, then we can't, how do we connect to the stories of others? How do we learn?
Mm-hmm.
Without
Mm-hmm.
literacy. And it's not that it's impossible, but you're certainly not going to gain any sense of independence in the world, right? It's like, what do you do if you can't count? Everything, we live in a capitalistic society, everything runs on money and numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's the question that always humbles me in this work, because
Yeah.
I know that, just yesterday I recently found out the godmother of bibliotherapy is a Black woman, Sadie
Wow.
Peterson Delaney, and I found a
Oh my.
nonprofit, and
Wow.
she's nowhere in the books on bibliotherapy, by the way.
Oh
If
man.
you look her up in library sciences, you'll find her, but she's not given the credit that she's due when it comes to establishing the programmatic aspect of bibliotherapy in veterans hospitals, etc. She's literally the blueprint for
Wow.
bibliotherapy in veterans administrations.
Man.
But all that to say that, like, man, it's the deeper that I go in this work and the more that I learn, the more that decolonizing therapy, it's clear to me that it's really the heart of it is accessibility. So I'm really big also on like finding ways to engage youth and children in particular, and adults too, in this work,
Mm-hmm.
however they can access it and however they enjoy accessing it, because reading is meant to be enjoyed. So the use of audiobooks, I use a lot of graphic novels. My son is autistic and nonverbal, so we use a lot of stories without words, but with
Mm.
vivid, beautiful, Afrocentric pictures and
Wow.
illustrations, right?
Wow.
And I think because I have a background in social work and I'm a therapist, right? I have these tools that I can pull from to get creative around using the use of stories and literature in my clinical work and my developmental bibliotherapy work with children as well. And with adults, I use a lot of children's books. When I say that, sometimes people are surprised, like,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
use children's books? Yeah, I do. Why? Because children's books have very few words. The language is simple. The illustrations are beautiful, and it's sort of a portal back to our inner child, right? When we read um, children's books that we loved when we were actual children, it reminds us of maybe a part of ourselves that we have abandoned or forgotten about. And sometimes
Yeah.
that's all the therapy that we need, is to remember, where we come from so that
Yeah.
we can really establish where we're headed. So
That's good.
those are just a few of the ways that I, scaffold learning and sort of make my work accessible. But it is hard, and I'm not gonna lie, it really is. And I've been reflecting lately, the more that I learn about the history of our elders
Mm-hmm.
that have been erased from the bibliotherapy books, the more that I've been thinking about how, like, reading in and of itself is having leisure time to read is a
Hmm.
privilege. Like
Yeah.
how many people have the free time? Like someone asked
Right.
me the other day, how do you read like 8 books a week? Right. And it's like,
Hmm.
well,
Hmm.
this is also my job. And I've worked extremely hard to get to a point where I could be independently licensed and have my own therapy practice. So now that I
Right.
read for work, I have more time to read. Right.
Right.
But
Right.
it wasn't always this way. And so I love what you said before that, like for you, you're a dad, you're a husband, you're a working man, right?
Hmm.
And you're a
Hmm.
Black man in America. So already your outcomes look different. So for
Hmm.
you, it's let me play an audiobook on the way to work or while I'm running errands. Like that's exactly how we do what we do.
That's facts. And also a tip for me, or a tip for everybody else. What I do is about 10 minutes a day, 10, 15 minutes a day. I try to get, if you think about it, if you can read 10 pages a day, you can read a 300-page book in a month. So you
Yes.
can read at least 12 books. You get a book that's 100 pages, you can knock it out in 10 days. So don't make the excuse, make
Yeah.
it happen, man. I'm a huge advocate for that. And honestly, it's like my man Jadakiss said, man, you want to hide something from one of us, put it in a book. I ain't gonna say the word,
Yes. I
right?
love
But
Jada.
yeah, Jada is that dude. But I even talk with kids when I'm in the school speaking, and I hear a kid come up to me and say, yeah, I want to be a rapper. Right. So I teach them the value and the importance of education, because I'm like, you don't think these lyricists, like, their vocabulary is like amazing, right? It's impeccable. Um, you can't just anyhow, because I was gonna go in, that's a whole nother story going into like today's rap. But like the Jadakiss per se, my man is intelligent. You could hear it through his rhymes. But reading is definitely a beautiful thing. I know we're pressed with time. I don't want to take more of your time. Go on her website, Literacy NYC, right, .com.
You got it.
I'll have it in the description. Check it out. She has some amazing things. She also offers some online sessions. And it just connect, right? I mean, if you don't have a therapist, you can't find one. She has opportunities where you don't have to use insurance. You can just go direct to the source. And I'm a huge advocate for therapy. So definitely check it out. Before you go, I always ask my guests to kind of share something from the past. So if you can go back with what you know now to that 14-year-old or that 17-year-old, and you can give yourself a piece of advice that will help you turn your dream to reality or get there closer, bridge the gap, what would that be?
Yeah. We make meaning out of our life through stories. And I think one of the things that I would want to remind myself and every young person out there, and really anyone of, is that some stories share the truth about who we are. Some stories don't, however.
Mm,
Some stories are inherited. And by looking at the meaning that we make out of the stories that we tell ourselves, we can really tease out what's true about us from what's untrue. Because so much of the work around authoring the life that we want, making our dreams come true, and stepping into the fullness and the authenticity of who we are and who we're meant to be in this world is letting go of inherited stories that were never ours to begin with, right? So I'll give you a perfect example. When my grandmother died and I started acting out because I was depressed, I heard a lot of different things. Oh, I'm being fast. Oh, I wasn't being fast, right? I remember I had like a 20-year-old boyfriend at 16 and that was like very taboo. That man had a car. I
mhm.
needed to get to work,
Right. I need to
right?
get, yeah.
I wasn't
Yep.
being fast. Like
Yeah.
I was alone in the world with no guidance.
Right.
And so I think when we s- hear these judgments and what other people, think or say about us, we internalize those things as being true about us. And those things are not true. Those
Yeah.
things are inherited. Those things have been internalized. And part of shedding shame and letting the weight of those things that were never true to begin with go is allowing our voice to become louder
Mm,
than all of the false voices that we've internalized. And that takes work, but healing is possible. And we get to reauthor a truer story
mm.
about who we are and who we want to be in this world.
Wow, man. Listen, that's powerful. And I heard authenticity, and I tell people all the time, listen, you cannot be authentic if you don't know who you are. And we have a lot of people trying, if you don't know, if you're not self-aware, right? You
Yep.
don't know your strengths, you can't act in your superpower, right? So there were things about me that I was insecure about because of how other people's, accepted me. I'm a very direct person. I like to get things done. I don't like excuses, right?
Yep.
And I took this disc assessment, and it said these are my characteristics, these are my superpowers. And I'm like, yo,
You owe you.
oh, you already know. You owe
L-
you, right?
Love that book.
Oh yeah,
Love
amazing
that
book.
book.
Yeah, shout outs to my mentor, Dr. Eric Thomas, ET. And so, yes, man, the flight is like, you just have to know yourself and you be able to walk in your superpower. Listen, you can't, my bishop says this all the time, man. Be original. Be a designer's original, right? That you can't replicate. So you won't be successful replicating someone else's dream or
Yep.
someone else's vision for you. And if you don't know your dream or your goal, then you're definitely working towards helping someone else get to their dream and go. So that's what we'll leave you with, man. Listen, shout outs to your daughter. I wish she was able to get on the podcast, but we'll get her. I'll get the whole
I'm sure you'll
family in.
hear her in the background.
Yeah, oh yeah, we'll get the whole family in. But just thank you so much for what you do. Honestly, I wanted to bring you on the podcast, just to give you your flowers and let you know, like, you're doing amazing work, and needed, right? Because arts is so important. I was just sharing this with one of my friends, like, it's a dying, um, art is dying, right? Like,
Yeah, we're
they're
cutting all the
taking it,
money
cutting
for
it, the
in
money out
schools.
in schools. That's one of the first programs that get cut. And to me, that's what brings out the creativity. And like you said, now I know it's not just creativity, it's therapeutic. So
Absolutely.
yeah, it's beautiful. Listen, thank you so much. Shout outs to you. We'll have all the social media handles. Go follow her on social media. Again, check her out in the session, if you will. There you have it, folks. The Desire to Dream podcast with your boy Lo and my sister M. We appreciate you, and we'll see you next time. Peace.